we're recording this session. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome our guest on today's webinar. Her name is Nabila Jiwa. Sultana, are you okay to go on to the next slide? So just to introduce Nabila, she is head teacher at Richmond Park Academy, which is based in West London, in Richmond, and she's the head teacher there. She's also a YSB board member, and I'll be talking with her as another senior leader. I'm a senior vice principal at Isaac Newton Academy, which is an all-through school in Ilford, Redbridge, and I'm an education board member. So we've got a selection of questions that we know are key and on people's minds, and we're just going to go through them bit by bit. But as I've said, we welcome questions from you as parents. We understand that this is quite a nerve-wracking time for people. We also understand that there's lots of new messages coming out at kind of on different days. Things seem to be moving, and we're just here to really help you navigate your way through that piece. So if we could just go to the first question. So first question is, when it's ready, there we go. I'm nervous about sending my child into school. How will secondary schools keep them safe? So Nabila, over to you.
Hi everyone, Yaling did. Thanks Sigra and AKEB for inviting me to be part of today. I know that this is a question that everyone is really worried about, and I know that Sigra and I were just talking about the report published last week about this question as well. I think the thing to say though is that secondary schools are putting in a lot of effort to try and ensure kids' safety. As a head teacher myself, I've spent the whole of half term writing risk assessments, measuring classrooms, and so on and so forth. And I've spoken to lots of other secondary heads who are doing exactly the same thing. So I think what might be helpful is if I share some of the things I'm doing in my school, which I think is resonant across lots of other schools as well. So for example, what the method that we've gone for is that we've got like pods, or the bubble method, where students are in a class of ours is about 12 kids in a class, up to 15, and they do not mix with other bubbles. They stay in their bubble, and they have all of their lessons in the same seat, in the same classroom, with that same group of students. We've measured out all of our classrooms so that there's 2 meters between each student, and we've actually made sure that there's a bigger gap between the students and the teacher, because the research is suggesting that it's the face-to-face contact that is the one that we need to be most mindful of. Whereas, you know, a student who's behind another student, then they're only in front of the back of their head, which isn't as much of a transmission risk. So, you know, we've put lines on the floor. We've been really explicit about, you know, how a child on this side of the room can go to the toilet if everyone else is sitting down, and it's not been very fun to plan, but there's a lot of safety measures within that room. We're using different entrances in our school building, even fire exits, to get students in so that they're not all congregating through one entrance and one exit. We've ordered a ton of digital thermometers, so we're going to take their temperature when they come in. We've got a lot of hand sanitizer, and the expectation is that they just hand sanitize all the time, every time they enter, leave a classroom, the corridors, building, etc. In our school, we've also cut down any unstructured time, so there won't be any break, any lunch time, so that it's not a time where we can't police physical distancing. I know some other schools haven't gone for that method, especially primary schools, but in secondaries, it's kind of okay for us to do that. But I think the cornerstone of all of this is that this plan only works alongside an effective remote learning plan, and so we're still keeping remote learning fully in force, and a quarter of our students will be coming into school at any one time, and then the other 3 quarters will still be learning virtually. So I think secondary schools are going through a lot of effort to make sure the building is safe. I mean, I on Friday went and did a big walk around my school site with the cleaners, and just made it really explicit about this handrail, these toilets, you know, this keyboard, this desk needs to be cleaned continuously throughout the day, so that we've changed all of our cleaning rotas, we've increased the hours, and we're making sure like really little things like handing out books and stuff just doesn't happen anymore. Kids will just have what they need on that desk that day. It will stay there for the week. You know, we'll put a pen there so that there's no kind of risk of transmission through as many things as we can kind of plan in advance.
Thank you so much for that, Nabila. And I think it's worth just adding in some of the other bits and pieces that I've heard through the grapevine as well. So I think one thing that's really noteworthy is that even though it's not a government requirement to do testing of temperatures, it's noteworthy that many schools are taking it upon themselves to add in that additional provision and measure. So I think that that's worth kind of highlighting, that schools take the business of safety really seriously, and if that's deemed to be an appropriate measure in that school or that trust, that's a measure that they're taking. I think the other thing that's been quite interesting to note is that the government have said that most of the learning is still going to be via remote learning. So this kind of sense that it's not back to normal, it's not business as usual, and this kind of sense that school is back to school on the 15th onwards. I think everyone's kind of got to have a sense of what that looks and feels like, and it is going to be very, very different as an experience. I think one other thing that we've been exploring as well is staggered start times and finish times, just to make sure that there's no risk of any additional kind of congregations of students, so that we can kind of manage that in a really safe way as well. But I think one other thing that's worth kind of saying is that the secondary guidance, kind of in its final, like most final form, only was shared over the half-term holiday. And so whilst there'll be many schools like Nabila's school, which is very kind of far along the track of what the planning will look like, there'll be some schools that are still digesting and absorbing and may not be able to give as many kind of answers right now. But they will be over the course of the next fortnight sharing plans for parents and carers of students in year 10 and 12. I think that's probably a sensible segue to us going into the next question, which is, a very good question. Do I have to send my son or daughter into school? What are the implications if you don't and your son or daughter is in year 10 or 12?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. The government have been really explicit about the fact that they will not be fining students or parents for not attending. And so in terms of a monetary fine, as schools normally have, that is no longer in existence, at least for this next half term. I think what we do need to consider, though, are the kind of softer implications of doing so and of not doing so. So, for example, if you know there are more than just the kind of physical distancing health reasons for not doing so. So there's social reasons for sending your child back to school, which is that they might need at this point the interaction. If we can have a safe and healthy environment where we've taken all these precautions to make sure schools are safe, that there is a real social benefit of sending them back. There's also the academic benefit. I mean, Sugar and I have been teaching for a number of years, and I've been teaching every single day virtually. I've got a great class, but it's not the same. And I think students know that, teachers know that. And so I think the academic benefit, I think the social benefit is huge. There won't be a monetary fine if you do choose not to do so. But I guess my advice would be, unless there's a huge, health reason, in terms of, if your family's vulnerable or shielding, absolutely, that's absolutely a sensible decision to do so. But if not, then do consider the safety measures the schools have put into place. Schools should share with you their risk assessments and their plans, and if you feel comfortable with that, then there's a huge benefit of sending them back as well.
Yeah, and just to echo that schools will be endeavouring in all ways possible to make school as safe as they possibly can. So only you will know what's right, but I think there's also something about us all being mentally prepared for what September will bring as well, and us being comfortable with the idea that we are returning to school. So if you can, and you feel comfortable with what the school has shared in terms of their safety provision, then I would echo what Nabila has said in terms of really advocating the benefits of that face-to-face interaction. Could we move on to the third question, please? Which is related to a question that was literally just put on the chat box. It was as if we were in sync there. So it's my child is in year 8. Will they get any time in school before September? Could you just talk us through what the government's position is on that, Nabila?
Yeah, sure. So I think initially, when the announcement for schools reopening was first launched, I think there was a possibility, and certainly some autonomy with schools to possibly open up before September for different year groups. The government advice that has now been released is pretty explicit in that it's very, very unlikely that the school will open for anyone except for year 10 and 12 before the summer term. Now, what they have said is that is entirely dependent on what Boris has talked about several times, which is, the risk of infection, R rate, the number of deaths in the community, in whichever borough, etc. we're in. And so the guidance might change. It is updating constantly, but at the moment, based on the current position, it's very, very unlikely that any other year group except for year 10 and 12 will go back before the summer. We certainly are. I'm in a large MAT. We're not planning a multi-academy trust. We're not planning for that at this stage until the government advice does change. Saying that though, we have really updated and refined our remote learning for Key Stage 3 to ensure that their online provision is really sufficient. And I think schools are really moving to ensure that provision is as strong as it can be, knowing that it's unlikely that they'll come back before.
Just to add to that, I would say if as a parent your son or daughter is in year 7, 8 or 9 and you are concerned about the missed learning time or the quality of remote learning that's being set, I would urge you to get in touch with your school and just talk about it. I think it's a partnership always between parents and carers and the school. And so if you're hearing this message and thinking, oh, my son or daughter is in Key Stage 3, and I really sense that in the last half term plus the 2 weeks before lockdown, before the Easter break, the first 2 weeks of lockdown, their learning has been impacted, I would say you feel free. I would strongly encourage you to talk to the school about what the barriers are, what are the challenges, and just have that dialogue, because schools are still running. It's not that we have said that we are only offering provision to years 10 and 12. Schools are very much still operating to support students all the way through, and so you must kind of get in touch. But yeah, I would echo Nabila's comments about it not looking likely for pre-September for year 7, 8 and 9. Okay, the final kind of pre-question that we had was about missed learning time, particularly for young people who are in years 10 and 12 who've got big public exams in summer 2021. So what's kind of your knowledge or updates on what's going on with that?
This is a big question for parents, and also definitely for schools and school years as well. I know we're definitely considering this in a really serious way as well. At the moment, there's no kind of update on what's going to happen with those exams. So there's not a kind of fixed position on whether they will be cancelled or whether they will definitely go ahead or whether they will go ahead in the exact same form that exams historically have gone ahead. So there are rumours that they might take segments out of the exams to make them shorter, but there's a lot of complications with that, and there is absolutely no certainty of any exams changing whatsoever. So I think from our perspective, from school's perspective, we are planning as if exams are going ahead in the summer, next summer, for year 10 and 12. And I'd encourage year 10 and year 12 students to continue with that mindset as well, so that they are prepared should that eventuality occur. In terms of missed time, I know that lots and lots of schools are putting together really concrete plans, including this reopening plan, but also from September, to ensure that gaps are covered, to ensure that there is plenty of opportunity for students to catch up on this time that has been missed face-to-face. So, you might find that there is an increase in intervention time, possibly Saturday schools, possibly extra hours, or just more use of independent learning. We're setting our students some kind of independent things to do over the summer to kind of catch up on some of the concepts we've done recently. I'd strongly encourage year 10 and year 12 students to to be proactive and revise the content they've done already as well. This year 10 and year 12 is 50% of their GCSE and A-level respectively. So it's absolutely essential that everyone plans to carry on as normal. And I think, again, schools will do everything they can when we are able to get students back in the door to catch up on that time, to do those interventions, to recap the topics that we've been covering remotely or that students have been doing independently. But the onus will be both ways, and students need to try and make sure they're staying on top of topics and revising when they can, and using the absolute plethora of online resources available regardless of school provision, but the ones online anyway, to stay on top of their work, I'd say, as well.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I don't really have anything to add to that, except I suppose potentially it's quite an unnerving time for students at this point. It's been unnerving and very difficult for years 11 and 13 because they've obviously had to go through that experience of exams being cancelled. There's a huge kind of emotional piece about the loss of the closure of those key year groups for students, and schools will obviously do their bits in the right way in their context to kind of mark those closures, be it virtually or later on next academic year when it's safe to do so, have kind of those symbolic closures. But I don't want to kind of understate how rocky this would probably feel for sons and daughters who are in this stage, and just as you said, Nabila, providing that kind of calming presence as a parent, that kind of reassuredness around what you can control, which is completing the learning that you're being set, and kind of just being as match fit as one can be, irrespective of the circumstances, is really important. I mean, they're the official questions that we've been sent. We've had another comment or question around about the safety measures, and it's kind of let me just get it up 1 second. It's about schools having some risk, and I suppose Nabila, maybe if you could just talk about the process of what happens in a risk assessment and that kind of sense of how one assesses the risk and that process, just so that parents can have a bit of an insight. Because of course, like when one leaves one's property and goes out, there is always going to be some risk associated with COVID-19, right? That's kind of my take. But what can one do to mitigate the risks, and what have you been doing from a kind of the kinds of things you've been doing? If you could just maybe talk a little bit more about what you covered in the first question.
Yeah,
I think the other thing that's worth saying also, just to kind of really signal, secondary schools are not going back until at least the 15th. That's from the 15th, and schools, as I've mentioned, are going to be working through the guidance from the government that was issued this half term. So different schools will be at different stages. Nabila will be speaking in the context of her school and her multi-academy trust, but it can give you a sense of the ideas of what's kind of being thought through by head teachers kind of working in this context.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. Thank you, Salima, for that question. And yeah, like I said, I think cannot happen with any safety measure that we've completely conquered every possible eventuality with regards to managing this. But I think the point, which is what we talked about in that first question, is that there is a really thorough risk assessment process that schools are doing right now to try and mitigate and ensure that risk is as low as physically possible. My governing body will then scrutinise it, come back to me with changes, and I will have to implement whichever, however I can do that. There's then another layer of scrutiny, and then on that basis, I will share that plan with parents. And so it's not just a case of kind of schools having free rein to kind of do what they want. There is a kind of really clear checking process to us managing this risk as well. What are the biggest risks? And for that, we're talking about, physically distancing, hand sanitizing, the kind of really obvious basic ones that the government have been discussing for a long time. And we're just trying to make sure that there is very, very, very few opportunities where students will, with teachers or between students, have to be in any form of close proximity. We're encouraging hand washing and hand sanitizing continuously. As Sigra said, the kind of staggered start and end times to make sure that even outside of our building, that there is a very, very low risk of them congregating in one place. So we're trying to manage the risk both in the building and as they go between and to school as well. Now, obviously, schools are only responsible for so much. We cannot control stuff like public transport or, how they might get to school. But as soon as they kind of come into our vicinity, we're trying to do everything possible to lower the risk. So anything we can that we, some of the ones we've shared with you, but there's other ones as well. We've talked about corridors and movement around the building and lots of other ones that are very bespoke to individual schools that we are doing just to lower the risk as much as possible.
Just to add to that, I think one other thing, you spoke a little bit about what break and lunch times would look like in your context. So some schools are not having any break or lunch times. Some that are having like a grab bag lunch delivered to the classrooms, so that there's again minimal risk of students kind of having that the risks of not being in a socially distancing kind of model, that they have to still be socially distancing. So every school will be thinking about this differently, and the government's guidance has not been as prescriptive as it has been with the primary context. The primary context, it's very clear what the government is expecting, whereas with secondary, they've used the language of some face-to-face interactions or contact with their staff.
And equally, we're finishing the day around 1:30, so that students can go home before that kind of rush hour, effectively traffic or public transport or anything as well. It's not going to be at the same time. So absolutely, and we are going to encourage our students to kind of walk and cycle if they can, and be careful on public transport. We're doing a lot of work with them about hand sanitizing, wearing gloves, etc., so that if they do have to take that, that's absolutely fine. But to be careful traveling to and from school as well. And symptoms or anything like that, then we're not going to let them through our school gates to protect our staff and our other students as well.
Thank you for that, Nabila. I've got one other question. It's quite specific. It's about free school meals, and it's that my child is eligible for free school meals. Will they get this at school? And if I choose them not to send them at school, will I still get the vouchers as a replacement?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think most schools are operating on the model that vouchers will still continue, so that they will continue to offer vouchers. And I know that some schools are doing what Sugra suggested, a grab bag or a snack or something, but that wouldn't be in cancellation of the vouchers. Other schools are suggesting that if they come and take their lunch at school, then they will not get their voucher. But nobody will be cutting off vouchers if the student's not there. So as a parent, you are entitled to free school meals if the student is in school, and if that school chooses to give them at school, then that's fine. But because there's no legal obligation to send them in that sense, you still are entitled to get the vouchers if that student is not in school. So in our model, we're just carrying on with the school vouchers. Parents will still receive them, and we're just facilitating some snacks through the day to make sure they don't starve.
Yeah, and I think following on from that, if you are concerned, and I know that there was a lot of challenges at the beginning with the rollout of the free school meals program, my suggestion would be to contact your school in the first instance, because they'll be able to clarify exactly how the model is going to work. But as Nabila has said, no one will kind of lose out from this. We've got another question, Nabila. We've got loads of questions. They're all coming through. It's about what measures will take place if someone displays symptoms in that group of 12 that you were talking about, that protected group. What then happens?
Again, because we're working in a bubble method, our policy is if anyone in that bubble develops symptoms, the whole bubble will be advised to self-isolate for 14 days. And will be encouraged to do so. However, our teachers are not part of our bubble method, which is why I said that teachers have a bigger gap than the students. So our teachers, as long as they're not developing symptoms, will be fine to carry on. But the students themselves, we've been really explicit about the fact that if they're in the bubble one of them develops symptoms, then they absolutely all need to self-isolate.
And I know from my experience of seeing the risk assessments from my school that that whole piece around what happens at that stage is being really carefully thought through, and is a very big part of making sure that then people are kept safe, and you know that the bubble is kind of kept contained. That was our last question. Okay, so this is just to let everybody know that all of our webinars, including this one, will be available on Head Start, which is signposted here. I know that some parents will be quite nervous about talking about the emotional aspects and the elements around kind of preparing students emotionally, or their children emotionally, for this whole kind of period of time. There's some webinars on there. We've had historic webinars around that, and they've been kind of proven to be quite helpful and quite useful. There are also courses available on Head Start for people to access, lots of online learning resources. So please feel free to check it out and use this as an opportunity to work on things that you've got a kind of interest in. I just want to extend a huge thank you to Nabila for your time in coming on and supporting us